Hi, everybody. I'm Eric Johnson. I'm Skyline Properties designated broker, and I'm here today with Melissa Helland. Introduce
Yep,
yourself.
Melissa Helland here, Assistant Branch Manager at Skyline Properties in Bellevue.
Thanks, Melissa. All right, so we're going to be talking a little bit about the Buyer Brokerage Services Agreement. As you can see, this was revised on August 24th. For most of you, it was brand new on January 1st of 2024. Now it's going to be officially coming into play on August 17th of 2024. So you're going to need this. If you already have a buyer brokerage services agreement signed prior to that, it's good until it expires, and then you're going to need to use this one. If you have not gotten a buyer brokerage services agreement as of August 17th of 2024, you must use this one. So please go into the Northwest MLS and pull this form and use it going forward. So this form is required by law. The Department of Licensing is auditing our files, and they are looking for this form. And if you do not have it signed by your buyer prior to writing an offer, ideally have it signed as soon as you begin offering real estate services to your buyer. But it has to be signed and agreed upon prior to you writing up an offer, because the buyer can actually make a claim for your commissions and use them as credits if you have not gotten this signed prior to writing an offer. That's it's an unfortunate byproduct of everything here, but it's just like a listing. You would never do a listing without getting a listing agreement. Same thing. You're not going to work with buyers without getting a buyer brokerage services agreement. So be sure and get this. We're going to move down to a couple of the terms here. This particular video session is to really go over a couple of sections more than anything, because these are discussions you're going to be having with your buyer when you first bring this to their attention. So let's go to Section 5, compensation. The buyer acknowledges that there are no standard compensation rates and that the compensation in this agreement is fully negotiable and not set by law. So again, this is where you're going to be asking your buyer to pay you if the seller does not, or if the seller isn't paying enough, that kind of thing. So there is no standard, even though you may have a personal standard, that's fine, but there's no legal or MLS rule on how much they have to pay you for the work you do on their behalf. Okay, moving on. The firm may not receive any compensation for brokerage services provided to the buyer from any source greater than the amount set forth in this Section 5 or any subsequent amendment hereto. We'll get into that. The compensation for the buyer brokerage firm's services, the compensation shall be. So here it is, 5A. So say I wanted to get 2.5%. Bottom line, I need 2.5% from somebody in order to get out there and show houses and write up offers and go through all the stuff that's going to be involved. In that circumstance, I would put in 2.5% here. My buyer would need to agree to that, though. So, if my buyer may not want to pay that much. Melissa, you had a question.
Yeah, I do. I mean, as a buyer, I don't have the funds to pay that 2.5%. So what happens if they want to put zero there?
So that's a good question. So I'm going to go back up here to the top where it says, I'm going to highlight it here for you. Okay, so here we go. Firm may not receive any compensation for brokerage services provided to the buyer from any source greater than the amount set forth in Section 5 or any subsequent amendment hereto. So if I put zero right here, it means that I'm not entitled to anything more than 0%. Okay, my firm cannot receive more than zero from any source. That includes the seller.
Okay, that was my next
but then we get into the rest of that sentence. Any subsequent amendment here too. So if we do put zero here, I would use Form 41A, which is an amendment to the buyer brokerage services agreement, and I could actually change it there. So I'll say Yeah, so anyway, I'd have to do that on any offer, any home that we wrote an offer on, but that way the buyer gets to have some control because it'll be based upon what the seller is offering them. But it's my recommendation is try to get a figure here because you're going to have to negotiate. Otherwise, you're going to have to do another form, no matter what, if you want to get paid. Did that answer your question, Melissa?
Yeah, it does. And that can happen, that should happen, obviously, that prior to writing up an offer.
Oh, yeah, this whole form needs to happen before you write up an offer.
Well, yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
the amendment
Oh, the
portion.
amendment, yeah, that would need to happen, so say you go out and look at a house that's offering 2.5%, and your buyer didn't want to commit to 2.5% up front, but now that they're writing an offer on a house that is 2.5%, they are willing to allow you to get the 2.5%. You do the Form 41A and write it up to address that.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. 5B has to do with limited dual agent. We're not even going to read that because we don't do limited dual agency. Write NA in the percentage and leave it at that. Okay, NA for not applicable. And then for 5C, if the seller is not represented by a licensed real estate firm, then the compensation shall be, it'll be equal to the amount in subsection 5A if not filled in. So say you're doing you're showing your buyer a for sale by owner home and the seller isn't offering any compensation, you could still ask the seller to offer compensation. Refer back to our video on the purchase and sale agreement and the buyer brokerage compensation, where we talk about how to negotiate with the seller. But anyway, so if your buyer is offering you nothing here and you're doing a for sale by owner and you're no guarantee the seller's going to offer you anything, how are you going to get paid? And if the seller does, or if the buyer does offer nothing here, then you'd have to negotiate maybe with your buyer using a Form 41A later. But there's no guarantee that that anybody is willing to pay you in that scenario, and then you're going to have to figure out what you would do. So I would definitely tell my buyer always that, hey, you know what? My intention is not for you to have to pay this full amount, whatever we're offering here. I know that would be a hardship for you. And I do have to, by law, get an agreement that you would pay me this amount. But I will tell you right now that if the circumstances are there where you're going to be forced to pay me 2.5% because the seller is not paying me anything, you and I can have a talk about that, and we can change that on a Form 41A. Okay, does that make sense? Melissa, are you
Yeah.
hearing what I'm saying?
Yep, I'm hearing it. Yeah, I think it's just a really important conversation that you have to have with your buyer to, like you said, let them know that something has to be there, and the intent is you don't want them to have to pay the compensation, but I mean, you don't want to work for free either.
Right, exactly. No, that's it. So at some point there may need to be compromises made, and that compromise can be adjusted on Form 41A. Okay, so let's move down to section 6, because this is very different. 6 had a whole bunch of options for you on the form prior to August 17th. It no longer does. It just tells it like it is. It used to be that, if the seller was offering 2.5% and the buyer was offering 2.5%, great. The broker's going to get 2.5%. Now it doesn't necessarily say it the same way. So anyway, let's read this. So the seller compensation offer. A seller may, but is not required to, offer compensation to firm for representing buyer in the purchase of the seller's real property. The seller's offer, if any, shall be stated in the purchase and sale agreement. So again, if they were offering 2.5%, it's there. For those of you who watched our other video on both the listing agreement and the purchase and sale agreement and this topic, You know that the seller could be offering something where it says request in offer, which means you're going to have to negotiate it. Or it could be that it'll say none. And again, you can negotiate that, but there's no guarantee that there's going to be anything offered there. Let's move on to the next line here. The buyer may request that the seller pay the compensation to firm as part of buyer's offer, and buyer shall pay any amount of compensation not paid by seller. So this is, again, where that hard conversation is going to come up with your buyer. The seller is offering 1%, but my buyer broker, or excuse me, my buyer has offered me up above in section 5, offered me 2.5%. Then right here, this is telling the buyer that they have to pay an additional 1% because the seller's only offering me 1, but they offered me 2.5. So anyway, that's a discussion you might have to have. Go ahead, Melissa.
They'd be on the hook to pay that 1.5%, basically.
Right. So
Yeah.
what if that was a hardship for them?
Yeah, and if that was a hardship for them, like, you have to be prepared to have the conversation with the buyer, and potentially, depending on what the transaction looks like, and you could potentially amend the BBSA to have them pay less if you
Correct.
want to. That's yeah.
Yeah.
I
What
think
form?
that's
What form is that for the amendment?
the 41A.
Correct.
Yeah.
Perfect. Yep. Nope. That's exactly right. So yeah. So there. Yeah. It is something where when your buyer reads this, they may panic.
Yeah.
um, and so just reassure them that again, it's not your intent that they dip deep into their pockets to pay you. If we can get the seller to pay you a reasonable amount, and a reasonable amount may be less than what your buyer puts on the BBSA here. So that can be negotiated with that 41A. And then finally, it gets to if the seller's offer is greater than the compensation as part of the buyer's offer, the buyer may request that the amount of seller's offer that is greater than the compensation be credited to buyer to the extent allowed by the buyer's lender. So if my buyer was offering me 2.5% in section 5 up above, and the seller offered me 3%, then this is where my buyer could ask for the balance to go to them towards their closing costs. So in this case, in that example, it'd be 3.5% would go to the buyer's closing costs, and we'd use a Form 41C to negotiate that.
You said three
Melissa,
and a
I
half.
think you had a question on
I
a
think
couple of questions.
you answered it.
Let's hit it though, just to reiterate it.
What happens if the seller is offering 3% and the buyer's offering 2%? And so there's that 1% deficit that would go automatically to the buyer, or is that where what
So that's where I would discuss with my buyer. Now, as I'm telling my buyer, as they're filling it in and the buyer is offering me whatever percentage, I'll tell them, okay, look, if you're offering me 2% and the seller offers me 3, here's the win for you, buyer, is I'm going to pay you that extra 1% as a credit. So you
and if say like I had mentioned this earlier in one of our other videos, that you've been working with these buyers for 6 months, showed them many homes, and they actually feel like the buyer broker deserves that extra one, it's okay that we can amend, we can take that additional 1% if the buyer agrees.
Yeah, exactly. That's where that word may is so important here. It doesn't say will, it says
Okay.
may. The buyer may request that the amount of seller's offer that is greater than the compensation be credited to the buyer. So that, again, you'd use 41C to make that request. But yeah, if your buyer was in love with everything you did and they wanted you to receive the extra amount, then you don't have to do a thing and it'll just be whatever is on the PSA. So if the seller is offering 3% and on the PSA you put in that the seller is offering 3% and you're requesting 3%, then that's that.
And then you don't check that box.
That check,
Yeah,
exactly, the box that says that the credited to, credited buyer. So,
okay,
yeah,
okay.
yeah. So again, Melissa, what do you think would happen if the buyer was offering 3% on section 5 up here, but the seller only offered 2?
So, I mean, every situation and transaction is gonna be different. Um, if the buyer's willing to pay 3%, um, they can, uh,
The buyer would offer you another 1% there.
yeah,
They would just pay you 1%. So just to let you know, if you ever get into a situation like that where your buyer is paying you and the seller is paying you, you're going to have 2 commission disbursement forms these days. One of them is Form
okay,
40. You guys are all used to that one because the seller, it's the amount of commission you'd get from the seller. But now, for the amount you're getting from the buyer, you'd have to do a Form 40A. So just keep a mental note that if the buyer's paying you, it's a different form for escrow.
okay.
Okay. All right. Any other follow-up questions on this at this point?
No, not at this point.
Okay. So I'm going to encourage all of you who are watching the video, if you have follow-up questions, please reach out to your manager and fire off those questions. And if you're working with your buyer and you need to communicate with your manager to figure out what the buyer is going to be offering and why the buyer is offering you that. Let's talk. We can help you strategize that. And likewise, if you're in the middle of a transaction or you're about to write up an offer and the compensation amounts don't line up, what your buyer is willing to pay you versus what the seller is willing to pay, then and you're not sure what to do with that, please give your manager a call and we'll help you through that scenario. Okay, so very good. Well, thank you for joining us, and watch for some of the other, we've got 2 other videos again on one on the PSA and working with their buyer brokerage compensation, and one on the listing agreement for the seller offering compensation. Have a great day.
Thank you.